The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to When the Offender is the Victim. The current presentation is part of a larger training and technical assistance grant funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. So before we actually get started, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping issues. First and foremost, we definitely encourage you guys to ask questions throughout the training. A lot of the conversation is really better when we have some specific issues to respond to and questions from y'all's jurisdictions, especially with a smaller group. It's nice to be able to make it a little more tailored to what you guys need. Please ask all questions in the question portion of your dashboard, and I will keep an eye of those throughout the training. We'll answer them at the end if they don't fit in neatly with where we are in the conversation. There are a couple of sections where we will be asking for interaction from the audience. At that point, please use the chat portion on your dashboard. We'll be monitoring that, and Jim and Connie and I will be answering people's questions directly from there when asked. Okay. So as I mentioned, the current project is part of a larger OVW training and technical assistance grant. It is currently a partnership between APPA, the American Probation and Parole Association, as well as the Battered Women's Justice Project and the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Your presenters today. So my name is Megan Foster. I'm going to be the moderator of the conversation today. I'm a program analyst at APPA, and I've worked in criminal justice issues for about 10 years and manage a variety of APPA's grant-funded projects. So I work with everything ranging from workforce and workload issues, tribal programs, and victim issues and community supervision. Before coming to APPA, I worked as a direct practitioner and program manager in victim services and women's reentry programs. Jim?
Hey, my name is Jim Henderson. I work with the Battered Women's Justice Project. We are a technical assistance provider for the Office of Violence Against Women. Prior to working with the Battered Women's Justice Project, I was a probation officer overseeing the domestic violence and stalking offenders for the city of Ann Arbor. I also currently run a batterers intervention program in the Detroit metropolitan area. Glad to be here. Thank you, Megan.
All right, Connie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you joined us for this webinar. My name is Connie Neal, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. My organization is a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization which works to support nearly 100 domestic violence programs across our state, which serve nearly 55,000 survivors of domestic violence each year. My organization also works to improve statewide responses to domestic violence, including policy development issues for probation and community corrections professionals. I've had the opportunity to work with APPA for nearly 20 years to improve best practices for working with victims of intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And in addition, a little bit more about my background, I have previously managed multiple alternatives to incarceration, reentry, and community supervision services in New York, and also provide training and technical assistance on community supervision and domestic violence issues on a national level.
All right, thank you. So the goal of today's training is overall, the current project, we're trying to improve community supervision responses to victims of intimate partner violence who are currently under supervision. So a lot of the time, we spend most of our time talking about offenders who are on supervision, but we really want everyone to kind of put their mind to thinking more about the trauma experienced by the people on our caseloads, both previously and currently while they might be under the supervision, and how to appropriately intervene in those situations. So today's webinar is going to provide an introduction to working with this population. For anyone interested in learning more about this particular topic, please contact me for more information on training opportunities. My contact information is going to be available at the end of the training. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
All right, ready to jump right in. So for the next few minutes, we are going to be providing an overview of the dynamics of domestic violence and also help set the context for how many victims of domestic violence enter the criminal justice system. And what we know about intimate partner violence is that it is a pervasive issue that affects millions of Americans. And just by way of some statistics, I'm going to run through some numbers and information for you just to also help set the context when we're talking about survivors in the criminal justice system. We know that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. Also, nearly 30% of African American women have been victims at rates which are 35% higher than white women. For Native Americans, 55% of women and 40% of men have experienced intimate partner violence. And for those who are involved in the criminal justice system, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, between 40 and 57% of women in prison, jail, or on probation supervision reported experiencing physical or sexual abuse prior to their sentencing. And half reported that their abusers were intimate partners. So also, 40% of female probationers reported experiencing prior abuse as an adult, and nearly 60% of them had experienced abuse at the hands of an intimate partner. So overall, what this means is we're looking at over 162,000 women under probation supervision who have been abused by an intimate partner. I know many of you may be familiar with the power and control wheel, which you see on your screen now. This is a great tool to illustrate the techniques that abusers use to gain and maintain power and control over their victims. Physical, sexual, economic, and emotional abuse are major tactics that abusers employ. And we know that there are so many experiences of abuse that totally go under the radar of the criminal justice system. And many of those experiences of abuse do not involve any physical violence. So the impact of coercion, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, and isolation can be just as serious and significant for victims. But as the outer ring of this wheel shows, violence and the fear of violence is really what holds everything together. Over the past few years, we've learned a lot about the pathways of victims of intimate partner violence who enter the criminal justice system. As you can see on this slide, we know that over 56% committed a crime to please their partner. Nearly half committed a crime to get drugs for their partner. 40% admitted to a crime that was committed by their partner. Nearly a third committed a crime because they were threatened by their partner. Over half lied to hide their partner's crime. And 1 out of 5 chose to go to jail to avoid their partner's abuse. So for many of these victims, jail was their safe house. Many would enter with bruises and injuries, but they felt like they were in a place where they could be safe and okay for a few days. We know that many victims of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, sometimes their pathways into the criminal justice system can be due to crimes directly related to their abuse or indirectly related to the abuse. Some of the crimes directly connected to abuse include using force to protect themselves or their children. If you can imagine a survivor being cornered in a kitchen, she's backed up against the kitchen sink and is being strangled. In that split second before she loses consciousness, she reaches behind her and finds a steak knife in the sink. In that moment, she may have no other choice than to use that knife to protect herself and to save her own life. Another example might be fleeing a location to protect herself and their children, and resulting in being charged with something like parental kidnapping. It's common for many survivors to hear multiple threats from their abusers about the physical safety of themselves and their children. Some of those examples could include, if you leave me, the next time you see the kids is when you go visit their gravestones. Or, if you want custody of the kids, I'll make sure you're together forever. Crimes indirectly connected to abuse include prostitution, drug dealing, welfare fraud, bad checks, and credit card theft. Many survivors have few options for how they can support themselves and meet the basic needs for themselves and their children, such as food and clothes. And many may be forced to support their abusers as well and have little or no control over or access to finances. For example, an abuser may tell the survivor that diapers, formula, or shoes for the kids are too expensive and the abuser is simply not going to pay for it. The options that victims have to support themselves and their children may become narrower and narrower and result in difficult choices such as having to deal drugs or steal a credit card simply as a survival strategy. So what do we know about women under probation and parole supervision? As you can see on this slide here, just to really assume and know, the vast majority are victims of domestic violence. If you are a community corrections officer and have 10 women on your caseload, at least 8 will have had experienced physical abuse in their lifetime. And know that nearly half have been raped or sexually abused.
So many of us have had an opportunity to have domestic violence training. We may even had training specifically on how to work with victims in our cases. What we're looking at here is a little bit different. We're trying to address how are we going to work with women who happen to be on probation for their own issues, maybe related to their domestic violence, victimization, maybe non-related. And so we're trying to figure out how do we go about finding and supporting this. So the one thing, our number one first priority is that all supervisees are safe and that none of the court's policies or practices places anyone's safety in jeopardy. Offender accountability then takes a back seat, which is a paradigm shift for many of us probation officers, because we've always looked at our job is to hold this offender accountable for their crime. However, if the sanctions by the court or the supervision techniques of the officer actually puts that victim or their children in jeopardy, we would suggest that that is not justice and that is not the practice of the court. So understanding really the dynamics of intimate partner violence and the safety concerns around leaving a batterer, safety concerns about being compliant with us when a batterer maybe enforces or sabotages somebody's ability to be compliant is imperative. When you're preparing for screening, one of the things we want to do is we want to really start to think about how do I ask questions in a way that is safe. Sometimes partners are or probationers will show up at appointments. They may demand to be there to support their partner, and probation may feel pressured to let that person in. Most probation departments around the country have found it fairly easy just to implement a policy that they never see offenders with their significant other. We can go and say that this is a confidential meeting. We will be more than happy to meet with you after I meet with this particular person, and your meeting will also be confidential. So there's ways that we can kind of meet the needs of a concerned partner who may actually be a great support, but early on, we're not sure if meeting with that person is going to be advantageous or harmful. So to be safe, probation officers have been encouraged not to meet an offender with their significant other or other family members at initial meetings when screening and assessments are being done. We want to also, when talking to somebody under supervision, if we're going to start asking them questions about their life experiences and their life situation, what are we going to do with that information? What is the limits to my confidentiality? And who else in our community may be able to offer confidential services? I like to remind people that I'm the ears and eyes of the courts, and everything that I hear, I may have to report back to the judge. And therefore, some information may be safer not shared with me. One of the things I often like to do is tell people I'd prefer they never lie to me. Just if I ask a question that they feel too uncomfortable answering or they feel would cause harm, to go ahead and just let me know, Jim, I don't want to answer that question right now. Could we come back to it another time? And give them an opportunity to reach out to a victim advocate and make that clear that that's acceptable. We want to create a safe environment where people can disclose. So we have to really look at how we ask questions. Historically, probation officers kind of been trained to interrogate. So when an offender is lying to you, you confront them with the evidence. When we're looking at domestic violence, we don't want to confront a victim with the evidence that we see. We may show and share, hey, I'm concerned. I see this red flag. This thing is coming up. It worries me. But we're not going to confront people in the same way that we would traditionally in a probation setting. We also want to make sure that if we're working with somebody who English is a second language, that we follow federal laws and provide interpreters. And we do not take shortcuts by using friends and relatives. And even though we have federal statutes around this, when we go into some communities, it is far easier to use a friend who shows up with them or a relative who shows up with them, but that really does an injustice to the population that we're working with, and we're not going to be able to offer them the same type of service that we could have done if we'd done that differently. Many victims are reluctant to interact with community corrections. right? The criminal justice system has not always responded well to women. I was just watching a video from Michigan the other day where an offender who had strangled his partner and drug her through the house had gotten a plea agreement to simple assault. And during her victim impact panel, she was confronting him and said, you know, a simple assault would be a slap across the face. It's not you strangling me multiple times and throwing me around the house like a rag doll. So if we work with somebody who's now on probation, maybe for substance abuse that may or may not be related to the trauma that they've experienced from the offender, maybe committing a crime that they were forced to do or had to do in order to avoid violence from their partner, and we've not dealt with them appropriately in the past, maybe gave them stiffer consequences than we did the perpetrator, there's no reason for this person to trust us. And I think as practitioners, we got to be careful not to get frustrated or mad when we're trying to be there for someone. We may have to work very hard to gain the trust of that individual. Remember, a lot of people don't like the term victim. Don't make an assumption that the person that's before you wants to be called a victim or a survivor. If they have experienced victimization at the hands of another person, we want to be able to acknowledge that that was unjust and that was uncalled for and they deserve better. But be aware that many people are not going to come forward raising a flag and telling you that they've been victimized. The other issue is if they tell us, what are we going to do with the information? They're not sure that we're not going to go confront their partner about it, that we're not going to go file charges against their partner, and we're not going to throw them back in the system. We're going to take their children away from them. All of these are really valid fears for the people that we're working with. So A, we can work better with victim advocates to figure out how to relay to women that we're working with, or men, if you have a male who you feel has been victimized by someone, how do we relate to them that we're concerned, we care, and we want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to cause them further damage or harm. You know, many of our offenders still want to stay with their victim, you know, or stay with their perpetrator. This person may not be bad 100% of the time. They may provide some good to the home. They may help take care of a sick, ailing parent in a home. They may provide certain things for the children. And so there's this real pull about, I'm not safe, I'm scared, but I still love this person. And so that's where we want to, again, if we can have a relationship with victim services, connect people in a way where they can create a safety plan for themselves and go through the process to deciding is leaving in their best interest or not, is staying in their best interest or not. But while you're making that decision, how do we keep you safe? And how do we make sure that the court is not putting you in further jeopardy? When you're going to screen, there's a variety of screening tools out there. Some people now are using the Odera to screen. Some people are using the DVISR. Some people are doing DVRNA. All of these are really good tools. I think the concern that some of the tools that probation and parole are doing is underestimates lethality and underestimates risk for domestic violence. So be aware when you're looking at your tools, do these tools specifically address issues related to lethality and concerns? I want to know, what do you guys, are people using different screening tools out there? If you could take a minute and just maybe go to your chat box over on your right. If you're using some tools and have found them helpful, we would love to hear and be able to talk about that with people.
Yeah. And as we do this, go ahead and make sure that your chat function is set on entire audience so that we can all kind of go back and forth and talk about what you're using. If you're working with a department that doesn't currently have a specific IPV DV assessment tool, and you just have some questions about tools or whether or not they're really going to be more useful than other assessments, please go ahead and ask those questions as well. Okay, so we have someone saying the DVSI.
Okay, yep. And so those tools are probably the DVSI, if I'm correct, that's a tool really more for the perpetrator. And most of the tools that are out there really are for an offender, other than Jacqueline Campbell's tool that looks at lethality and risk to a victim. The ODERA would still be more on the offender if they're going to violate or not. Same with LAP, because those are all created to be used with whoever the person is who's doing harm. I would say Jacqueline Campbell is probably the #1 used tool to use with a person who's being victimized. So part of our job, I think, if we don't have specific tools for us, rather through our pre-sentence investigation or through our ongoing interviews with our offenders when they're coming in, how do we talk to them, or what do we look like that would be kind of a red flag that domestic violence might be going on, right? So if I have a young lady come in, or a young man, he's talking about his partner, and they're talking about constantly being criticized, about their ability to parent, their ability to maintain a job, to comply with probation. We want to look at how do they feel in their relationships. Does your partner support you? Does your partner put you down? Is your partner extremely jealous? Are they overprotective? Right? If you see a person that's constantly bringing them to court, we need to ask questions about that. I notice that George consistently brings you to all of your meetings. Does George go everywhere with you? Right? Maybe my person no longer has a driver's license, and George is their only way that they have for transportation, and he's not in any way, shape, or form, a controlling person. But we want to at least be able to ask questions and go down that road. I want to know, how do they manage conflict in their family? Who has the worst temper? Is anyone scared of the other person when they're scared? So I can ask that question in a very open-ended way, or I'm not accusing you of being a victim or a perpetrator. I'm asking about family dynamics. And then based on the information you give me on those family dynamics, I can go down a little bit further and screen a little bit deeper and try to figure out, okay, is this person scared at home? Is this person being controlled at home? Does this person have any agency in their decision-making? Will their probation be hindered by their significant other? And does probation put, restraints on them that are going to cause harm? The other thing that we can look at for screening is, that some women have talked about, or men, if you happen to be in the LGBT community, if you have certain medical issues going on with you, sometimes a partner may threaten to out you or disclose that information. We have people who have had revenge porn used against them, the pictures that they never wanted out there. So to be able to know if the people that I'm experiencing, if I'm working with, if they have some severe medical issues, or if they're from the LGBT community or not out, just even asking, has your partner ever threatened to out you to anybody? Has your partner ever used that as a way to control you? Can be an interesting way of kind of finding out what's going on in the home and what are some of their concerns. And all sorts of, there's a variety of other things up here. Having people have, forcing them to have sex, which most people are probably not going to admit to us right away. But even you have control over your own birth control rights, right? Some people find that they no longer get to have that choice. So just doing a regular screening, you can find those types of information out. Yeah. If this person is an immigrant, is that affected? If they're an undocumented immigrant, how is that impacting their ability to comply with probation? How is that impacting the amount of control that their significant other can have and exude over them?
So, Jim, I want us to sit here for a moment, because a lot of these questions are obviously very personal, and as you've mentioned, a lot of people might have a hard time answering them or be reluctant to answer these sort of questions to someone in our position. So, especially if you're not using an assessment, what are some ways that you would go about asking some of these questions to get a little bit more information on the situation of your client?
First of all, when I'm getting deeply personal with someone, I always let them know I'm going to ask you a lot of personal questions that realistically would probably be none of my business, other than I want to make sure that nothing I require of you or the court requires of you puts you or your children in danger or jeopardizes your ability to comply with probation and obey with the law, right? And so I let kind of people know what I'm going to do with that information. And I tell them there has been times I've asked people questions that they thought if they were honest with me, that life could become more harmful and put them in more danger than if they were dishonest with me. If that's the case with you, I'm giving you permission not to answer a question. If you feel you can't do that and you don't feel comfortable and you don't feel safe with that, for whatever reason, maybe it's just the fact that I'm a male and you're a female and you feel uncomfortable, and I'll respect those boundaries. But then I make sure that I go back at the end, address what issues maybe the person did not want to share with me, and try to relink them up to victim services. The other thing that I tend to do if I'm talking about violence, Megan, you've seen me do this a few times in the training, I tend to try to normalize violence in the beginning, because if I go ask a person, has your husband ever punched you? They're all going to say no, almost everybody, even people who I have evidence their husbands punched them. When I kind of talk to people, just like, like every one of us experience issues in our relationships. When you first meet someone, are they not perfect? Right? They wear cologne, they talk to you nice, they probably open the door to the car. When you go out on dates, they pick up the check. You get to date my representative, right? This is the best Jim can be. And then after a while, that wears off. I'm no longer opening your door. I leave the toilet seat up now. I leave the toothpaste off, the toothpaste cap off. So you start to see that Jim now isn't perfect, that maybe he's a project, but I'm still worthy of you staying with me, right? After a while, that can even wear off. So when I talk to people about that, everybody identifies with that. Everybody knows their partner was perfect when they first met him and are not perfect now. Then I kind of slip in, how long was it into your relationship before Johnny was willing to say hurtful things to you? So somebody will say, 6 months to a year. How long was it before he was willing to call you out of your name, right? So that might be around the exact same time. Then we'll slowly inch into more, sometimes when people are angry, they might grab their partner, they grab their attention, or they might push their partner or even pinch their partner. How long was it before Johnny was willing to do something like that? And then we might talk a little bit about what Johnny's done, and then we might take it up to the next step, right? Sometimes partners will call their partners more than they would like, or check up on them at work, or jealous. So we'll kind of take all these things as almost normal things in a relationship. Then we'll pull in the power and control wheel if I'm concerned. And I'll say, let's talk a little bit about what we talked about, what's going on with you and Johnny. And, if I could take the power and control wheel, we know that Ellen Pence created that with a group of survivors where they talked. And at the beginning, they kind of got mad at the advocates and said, you guys keep thinking this is about violence. It's not just about violence. It's about all these other things he does to control me and take away my agency. So we tend to make it all about physical abuse. And what the survivors were saying is that was such a small part. It was really all these other things that happen on a daily basis that took away any agency or control. And it was the fear of the physical and sexual abuse that allowed all those little tactics to work. And so it's just a way then we can, once we identify that abuse is going on, we can then talk about, they deserving better. And some victims will blame themselves. You don't understand, I have a drug problem, or I'm mouthy, or I'm pretty aggressive too. And you say, you don't have to earn the right not to be abused. If if you are a bad partner, I have a right to divorce you. I have a right to break up with you. I have a lot of rights. But hitting you, intimidating you, controlling you are not the rights that I have. And then we try to, work again towards connecting that person with victim services so they're not in a dangerous situation. So I've talked a little bit about Jacqueline Campbell's danger assessment, but basically what Jacqueline did is they went out and looked at all these women who had been killed, and it was really more on women, all these women who had been killed in domestic violence situations. And then they went backwards to say, what did these women have in common? And so she has a really short, and you can go to like dangerassessment.org and you can take some little classes. You can get certified to use her tool. She also probably has webinars. I know at BWJP, she's done webinars for us. She does a lot of national training. And, some of it has physical violence increased in frequency over the past year. All right. We will see an increase in frequency and intensity in domestic violence often. But then sometimes it's dramatically going up, which is a huge risk and concern. Has your partner ever used a weapon or threatened to use a weapon? Jacqueline Campbell now has added strangulation in there because they find that when a man strangles a woman, her past research said they were 750 times more likely to kill that woman in the future. Now it's up to 1,000 times more likely. So when a person has been strangled by their partner, the majority of the time, in the beginning, the partner does not mean to kill them. What they mean to do is to scare them and send them a message, I absolutely can kill you, and don't ever threaten me, don't ever push me. And so some people are starting to question now if that's almost practice, because it's creating me to be insensitive. Think about the amount of intimacy it takes to hold someone's life in my hand. So we really want to know, has he ever threatened you with a gun? Having access to guns in the home dramatically increases. If a man has threatened to use a weapon against his partner and he has access to a weapon in the home, that is a huge, huge issue that we can't ignore. We need to talk to her about our safety concerns. We need to try to hook her up with victim services. Clearly, if her partner is not on probation and he's not prohibited from having a gun, we can't do a whole lot for that, except for to try to make sure that she is aware of the dangers that she's in and what other options, supportive options, she has if she should feel she needs to get out of that relationship. Jacqueline has one of the things she says, the number one thing is does the partner think he has the ability to kill them? Now, here's the only thing she does say. If every one of the other things were no weapons, no strangulation, not increasing, but she says, I think he'll kill me, or I believe he's capable of killing me, that trumps everything. What she says is very rarely do women overassess this, but oftentimes women will underassess this. So I was working with one woman once. Her mom was scared to death that her husband would kill her. Her best friend was scared that her husband would kill her. Her friends at work thought her husband was going to kill her. And her husband's ex-wife told her that she thinks he was going to kill her. And yet she says, I just don't see it. And not even these people that are all telling her that he was going to kill her weren't even friends with each other. Like her mom wasn't friends with her colleagues at work, right? So these were people, none of those other people were friends with his ex-wife. So they were talked about when everyone around you is that scared for you and seeing that, we need to take that seriously. And for her, it was just not, if she let herself feel the terror and the control that was going around her, it would immobilize her. So the only way to do it was to compartmentalize it, put it in the back shelf, and not acknowledge it so she could function on a daily basis. So being aware, if a person feels that they could be killed, we absolutely have to take that seriously. But just because they say, no, he'll never kill me, doesn't mean that he won't, right? If these other things are there. And then, is your partner violently or consistently jealous? And so and those questions are pretty easy. People will tell you if their partner's jealous. Some people like when their partner is jealous. They feel that they're being loved. So we have to assess what's the level of jealousy, right? Does he check out? Does he check your phone all the time? Does he check your emails? Does he follow you? Does he quiz you on things? We've heard people going to weird extremes, making people undress when they get home and checking them out to see if they've had sex. These are things that are not normal behavior, and we need to be able to talk to and work with victims in those arenas. I don't know if Connie wants to mention anything about the danger assessment, just because you guys probably use it with a lot of women, Connie.
Yeah, I think Jim has been doing a great job of covering a lot of strategies and points of reference for doing assessments and asking questions. And again, you as a probation parole officer, community corrections professional, you may be the very first person that a survivor or victim has ever had this discussion with. You may be the very first person that has asked these kinds of questions. And I think really the balance of showing that you're deeply concerned and care for their well-being, but at the same time figuring out ways that you can also help support their safety is huge in doing this work. There's such a range of experiences, again, that survivors of domestic violence go through. And if you hear anything about fear, that a survivor is really afraid of what their partner is going to do next, or if you have any kinds of signs that that person may have been strangled, it's incredibly serious. So I think doing what you can to have questions like this, like assessments handy and ready to go for anyone on your caseload, because you may never know when you are going to find out that you have a survivor under your supervision, because it may have, again, nothing to do with the crime in which they've been convicted of, and it may have nothing to do because of the reason why they're under supervision and on your caseload.
So I would, under this part here, we're looking at goals of successful supervision. Is there any, out of the people who are on our attendees, have you guys found an offender on probation who happened to be a victim? And if you have, could you, I don't know, we don't have a raise your hand segment in here probably, but I don't know if somebody could write down how they found out real quickly. Like, did the victim just tell them, point out, tell them, or did they see a red flag or something that you searched down? Again, if you could just write that in the chat box, that would be great. What I'm hoping to do, if we could get just a couple examples of a victim that you've had on probation, then we can kind of talk about what successful supervision should look like. I'm not seeing any chats right now, so I guess we can go on. And you know, if we
Hey,
find,
Jim.
yes.
Sorry, I had myself muted. So I do
Okay.
have someone who said that they've had clients report abuse or past abuse.
Okay. So during, and then so, and the person's currently on probation, and they told us that's, to me, that tells me that that officer must come off in a way that that person felt safe and comfortable telling that, because people do not traditionally just go telling people randomly what's going on with them. When people are finding someone on probation who happens to also be a victim, go ahead.
So I have another one. There's someone currently on her caseload, and she apparently directly reported the abuse and said it was her first time fighting back.
Okay. And, oh, so was she the one being charged?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, that's happened too. So then look at that. Now I have an offender who contextually is a victim. Her victim is contextually a batterer, but has certain victim rights, right? He has a right to make a victim impact statement. Some states he has a right to know, her sentencing. He has a right to know a lot of information. Really complicates things for us as probation officers. I know in one state, because a woman had been murdered when a guy got out of prison and she didn't know where he was staying and he had moved to her town, they're now required to tell every victim where the offender lives, which could be a good thing if the offenders were really the offenders, but it's a really bad thing now when I have a victim under supervision. So really what we're trying to do is figuring out through our work with this person, how do we promote their safety, their autonomy, and how do we empower that person, right?
And I think there's a lot that probation and parole officers can do to help support the safety of survivors once you find out that you actually do have a survivor or victim on your caseload. There's a lot of work that you can do, certainly around safety planning, continuing to ask questions of that individual just to help them think through some next steps, that if they are in a place where they may need to get out of their home, for example, how can they get out in an emergency? I think on the next slide, Megan, there are a couple of things I really wanted to touch on here next.
Yeah. So hold on just a sec. I want to make sure that we hit all of the points in the current section, and then we'll
Okay.
get right. Yeah.
Okay.
So Jim, do you want to touch on anything on this slide?
Well, I think when we're talking to a person, obviously we're going to respect confidentiality, let them know what we're going to do. When a person talks like that woman, probably had, I'm assuming it's a woman, but whoever the person who was a victim fighting back, there's a lot of injustice there. The system may have been flipped on them. They may have experienced even the most abuse, but because they scratched this person, we were in Texas doing a strangulation conference the other day, and a woman that her mom was being strangled to the point where she urinated on herself, meaning that all oxygen was cut off to her brain for at least 13 seconds. They didn't realize that she had urinated on herself because of her oxygen. They thought she urinated on herself because she was scared to death. Anyway, the mom dug the guy, scratched him to get her boyfriend off of her. And the mom was the one convicted. The mother was the one who had to go through a batterer's intervention program, got all these costs and fines, is still a convicted batterer to this day. Why a potential killer is running free with no sanctions. That's a huge injustice. And there's going to be a lot of resentment for that client. So I think I have to acknowledge that our system is in no way fair or just, that sometimes things get flipped around on victims, and that we're going to do our best to try to give them the best services so they're not in a dangerous situation, kind of respect their autonomy, their rights to make their own choices, but to try to at least make sure that they know about what community resources are available. When you have supportive services, victims are much more likely to leave. When they have access to resources, they have a job, they have housing abilities, they have a way to keep their children safe. So some communities are creating family justice centers. Some shelters are really working on extended stays or kind of moving people back into the community slowly. So there's a variety of things that we can do to kind of balance how are we holding this person accountable for their crime, but at the same time, empowering them to live a safe life that's crime-free once they get off probation.
All right, so that balance sometimes is very difficult when you have a survivor under supervision. But again, there's a lot that you can do to help that person think through steps, resources that they have available to them, things that they can do in an emergency that will also help protect their safety and the safety of their children. You can see on the screen in some small print here, just some prompters that can really help that survivor think through next steps on what they might want to do with some planning in the event that an abuser does something next. For example, if you need to get out of your house or apartment in a hurry, which door, window, or elevator can you use to get out safely? Is there a place maybe that you can keep a change of clothes, maybe some money, the important papers for yourself and your children, like birth certificates, social security cards, just some of those important documents, or photocopies of those documents, ideally someplace where their abusive partner has no idea where that's at. It's all meant to be prompters. You, again, may be the very first person that the survivor is even thinking through these ideas, and trying to think through the resources and supports that they have available, again, to help support their safety and the safety of their children. Because, again, the balance with probation supervision, community corrections supervision, is looking at safety as the foundation for everything. And in those most extreme tragedies, it is incredibly hard. We just cannot go back if something occurs and unfortunately there's a homicide on the most extreme end of domestic violence issues. So there are some other safety planning considerations for survivors under supervision. I think if they have to call for help in an emergency, oftentimes the best strategy is to dial 911. Just continually doing what you can to also refer them to advocates and advocacy services in their community, because those advocates who have that kind of specialized knowledge around safety planning can do much more extensive safety planning work with survivors. But again, that should never be a requirement for them. I think so many survivors have had their ability to make decisions for themselves taken away by their abuser. So doing what you can to support, empower them, and constantly providing resources and referrals and information to that survivor, because they are the experts in their own safety, and they really know what they need to do from one moment to next with trying to keep one step ahead, ideally, from what their abuser is doing. A lot of times, safety plans are good in the moment. So think of that also as a living document of sorts. Even though safety plans should never be written down, they can sometimes be very transient, that what is safe for a survivor right now may change 5 minutes from now based on what their survivor is, or what their abuser is doing. I think also keeping an eye out for the ways that an abusive person may be using technology to perpetrate abuse. There's so much growing body of knowledge and information about looking at GPS chips, the ways that abusers can track what a survivor does through their cell phone, anything on their computer, putting a tracking device on their car. That truly is one of those growing areas where we're seeing a lot more stalking and a lot more control. That abusive person always seems to know where the survivor is showing up and where they're going and really tracking their movements.
Connie, can I add something there?
Yeah.
Sure. I think, especially when we're talking about technology, many of the people I work with have no idea what's out there, right? Perpetrators spend some time researching that, right? If I want to follow Connie, I'll type in how to track Connie, how to track your wife, how to track your kids, things like this. But somebody who's not looking to do that, they're not aware of all these types of tools. So just probation being aware of what's out there, what's being done, and being able to talk about that will raise that to an awareness. If you have a fear or a thought that your client is being stalked, you can go to coercivecontrol.org or to type in Sharp Tool. There is a free online assessment tool that a person can use that will tell them it'll ask them a series of questions, and then it will kind of assess for them if they're being stalked based on what the information is documented in there, and will even do a safety plan for the person. It would have to be printed out or it's forever lost. So if I did it at home, my partner wouldn't be able to see what I wrote because it gets erased from the thing. The other thing I was going to say about the safety planning for those probation officers who are going to the home, I do safety planning there. So let's say Connie doesn't want me to know she's a victim, but in the back of my head, I have a really bad suspicion that she isn't as safe as she says she is at home. I could do safety planning in that house just by saying, okay, let's assume somebody broke in this home right now. How would you get out safely? I could walk through some of those questions and not even make it about our partner. So in Ann Arbor, we had the Ann Arbor rapist, is what it's called, years ago. And so we would talk about that. If the Ann Arbor rapist broke in this house, how would we get out? How would we get help? How would we let the neighbors know? And just doing kind of a little role play safety planning that way, I found was a way to kind of sneak that in there. And the only last thing I would say, Connie, which I really liked about you talking about this being a living document, is sometimes probation, if we come from good systems, which I did. I had a really good shelter and a great prosecutor. So I knew that when an arrest happened, 2 victim advocates from our non-governmental agency went to meet with the victim, and they would do safety planning with them. However, by the time I seen the victim for probation, those victims didn't even remember the safety plan at all because they were in a crisis mode and things changed, like you were saying. So for probation, not to think, oh, she's already working with an advocate or she worked with an advocate last year, she has that. Sometimes we got to re-update those with people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think for many survivors, they continue to experience abuse not only for weeks and months at a time, but many for the rest of their lives, that there's always something that they have to think about in order to maintain their safety. So it is an ongoing process for so many survivors. And I think the other tip and strategy with planning is to also think about children and including pets as well. In rural areas also, there are many survivors who might be in farming communities. So they're also concerned about their livestock and what's going to happen to the horses, what's going to happen to the cattle. I think just really being open about those animals and people that are very close to the survivor, that those considerations also include safety issues for them as well.
Right. So, when we look at liability and ethical concerns, we have to really look at what are our mandatory violation reporting requirements for my agency, and being aware that sometimes my client's going to violate the conditions of probation because they had zero control in that. We believe that a person should not be jailed for a decision that they did not play a part in. So let's say here, my partner mandates that I drink with them last night, and that was the only way I could avoid violence. And that's a violation of the probation. How do I handle that with the court? Do I go back and talk to the prosecutor? I had a young drunk driving offender who is male, And that was just his case. His partner would mandate when they went on Tuesday night on dinner on Saturday night, he had to drink a glass of wine with him at dinner. So I had to be able to go talk to the judge and to the prosecutor and said, it's going to take me a bit of time to work on this guy's recovery because during that process as well. Some courts will order mandatory separation when they know that a person's living with an abuser. I would tend to discourage that. The research shows that 75% of women who are killed were killed as they were attempting to leave or had left the relationship. So just because I get a person out of an abusive situation does not mean I made them safer. I actually could have made things much more dangerous for them. So we need to, although I understand wanting to order that, it totally makes sense to me. We have to slow down and really, if you're that concerned for the victim, we should be partnering with non-governmental victim services and figuring out what types of court order is appropriate. And we might need to go back to the court and really advocate that some of the orders be changed. Let's say I got this person on house arrest, and I know there's going to be times where it would be far safer for them not to be in that home. Either I'm going to make that house arrest flexible and say, okay, if you violate it and you let me know, I'm going to work with you, or maybe we take them off the house arrest and do something different. But just think about your order and how it's putting people at risk.
So I think there's a lot that collaboration and partnerships between community corrections professionals and domestic violence advocates can really do to strengthen responses and to strengthen knowledge and information about domestic violence services in communities across our country. I think there are a lot of great reasons why it's important to build and reach out to domestic violence advocates in your community. When I think about probation, parole, and community corrections professionals, I think of you all as experts in offender accountability. You know, that's one of the key aspects of the work that you do. And then when I think about domestic violence advocates, they are experts in victim safety. So just imagine when we're talking about survivors of domestic violence under supervision of probation and parole, what an incredible blend that is to have expertise and knowledge around offender accountability and victim safety. I think that just makes for a tremendous and positive outcome. And I think there's also a lot that advocates can do to help support your work. So there are times perhaps when an advocate in your community-based advocate can help victims prepare for and understand paperwork that they may have to do if they're under supervision, if they're on your caseload. There could also be the potential that advocates can go to a meeting at your office, perhaps be a part of home visits, and really go through things like orders and conditions of probation or parole so that that survivor really has a better understanding of what you are expecting of them. And at the same time, that advocate is there just to help them with that ongoing safety planning process. Some of the primary goals of community-based advocates are to respect confidentiality, believe and validate the experiences of victims of domestic violence, and as Jim had said earlier, to just continue to reassure and provide messages back to the survivor that sometimes the injustice occurs, things aren't fair, it's not right, they didn't deserve to be abused, and there's help available for them. Just to really be there as a sounding board and a resource and a voice to help support their safety is so critical. Around case staffing points, there can also be a lot of times in which advocates can help provide feedback from other officers under, who are working on a particular case. If there's a survivor under supervision, being able to have that conferencing place within your policies and procedures is often a good step, particularly when you're looking at multidisciplinary teams that, again, involve community corrections professionals, human service providers, domestic violence advocates. Again, it builds a stronger response all the way around when there's a good solid foundation around understanding safety issues, strategies to help support that person under supervision, and building shared goals in the community around domestic violence responses with the end goal of helping to hopefully reduce domestic violence from occurring in the first place and helping that person or those survivors finish their supervision successfully.
just getting out of your office can be healthy for you, but it can be life-saving for the victim. So I would really encourage you, if you can, do a ride along with an officer. Get out of your office, go see what they do, see what they think about domestic violence, what do they think about the criminal justice system. Go, if you do a ride along with you and a victim advocate, even better. We also went and worked with our local advocacy agency. They allowed me to do the same training that they offer all of their new hires. Amazing way to get to know the agency, amazing way to get to know of all the resources that they offer, because I need to know what's available for the women that I work with in my community, or for the men, the trans community, right? What services, sometimes people have an assumption that domestic violence shelters only serve women, and that's not true anymore, right? They offer the same supportive services to men who are victims of violence. They offer the same services for people who are in transition or the LGBT community. So really knowing what services they offer, how are they meeting the needs of the underserved population are so important. We used to do brown bag lunches sometimes. We'd go to the Batterers Intervention Program, it'd be me, the BIP person, and the victim advocate. Then the next month, we'd go to the shelter instead. And the Batterers Intervention, myself, and maybe the prosecutor would come over there. Then they'd come to my office. We just kind of rotated around. Sometimes we'd order pizza. Sometimes we all brought our lunch. But just think about ways, if you can join a coordinated community, if you got like a coordinating council, probation oftentimes doesn't go to that. Line staff need to be there. We have a voice and a lot of information to give that group that can make a difference. If we look at Batterers Intervention, I would just say, again, go watch the programs. They're not all created equal. Some Batterers Intervention programs are nothing more than batterer support groups. And if we use the coercive power of the court to mandate people go there, we need to know what they're teaching. Go watch the men's program. I haven't went and watched the women's program, and maybe because I feel, maybe a woman probation officer should do. But be aware of what the women's probation, or the women's domestic violence programs are as well. If you have a woman on probation who you think is a victim, 100% is a victim who is fighting back, and this time just got charged because that's the way the law kind of looked at this isolated incident, she may not be appropriate for a Batterers Intervention program. So you might want to talk to those providers. You might want to work with victim services and work with your prosecutor and say, what do we do when we know that our offender is actually a victim? Is this program even appropriate for that individual, or are there other supportive services that would be more advantageous? Your community response, I just think, what do we have there? Elements of effective coordinated response. I think looking at our policies and practices, how are we linked to other agencies? We try to make sure I have the right police reports. I might have 911 tapes. We're doing the right assessments. We're working, just having a relationship with the prosecutor's office. They can give me a heads up if they know a person is a victim. But when I have an offender come in, who's any offender, I go look for prior orders of protection orders. All right, now oftentimes on a male offender, I will see that he's had prior orders of protection, maybe from multiple women. Well, now I know I got a batterer on my hands. But if I have a woman's name who's showing up there as the petitioner for the PPO last year, and she's still living with that person now, that was a huge, red flag for me that I could discuss with her about that and what types of things we could do. We try to attend trainings as much as possible, and we've asked victim advocates to come train us how to do victim interviews. They've come watched us do our pre-sentence investigations. They've watched me do victim interviewing. I've never had a problem with a client letting them watch. And then they offer me free advice on how I can make sure I'm not blaming victims, I'm not colluding with an offender. These are things that probation can fall into very easily. And having somebody who does that on a daily basis offer you free supportive training services is irreplaceable.
So I know we've covered a lot of information today. This is really just meant to be an overview on the topic to get some of you interested, or at least give you some idea of where to look for some more answers on the questions you have. So we are going to go over a few resources that'll help keep you guys informed. So first and foremost is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It's available 24 hours a day and can route people to additional services. Additionally, every state and U.S. territory has a domestic violence coalition. The New York State Coalition Connie's representing that here today, but there are similar coalitions in every single state in the union, and they're able to provide a wide variety of resources to both you all as officers and victims advocates, but also to the victims themselves directly. Connie, did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I think anytime you're dealing with potentially a survivor around interstate transfers, any other issues where a survivor is coming from another state to your location, state coalitions are a great resource because they know the domestic violence services and shelters that are available across that particular state. And also there are coalitions available in the U.S. territories as well. So again, a great resource for you all.
Okay. Additionally, for all the three organizations that we represent, all of our websites have a plethora of different types of resources related to this topic. In particular, for our community corrections folks, the APPA website has this document here, which is a comprehensive set of guidelines for working with around domestic violence issues in community supervision. So I highly recommend checking this out if you have further questions and concerns on this topic.
You know, Connie, that's just an amazing tool for them because it just shows what people are doing around the country. They can take it to their supervisors and they can say, hey, our national organization that represents us is recommending these. Can we talk about implementing this in our community? I really encourage them to brush through that a little bit.
Absolutely. Also, as part of this current project, we have 3 one-hour courses that provide some good information and good background on this topic. We also have one more webinar next Monday at the exact same time at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard that will be covering more in depth identifying victims and what are some of those red flags for knowing that there might be violence experienced by people on our caseload. All of these trainings are completely free and available to anyone in the public. So thank you all so much for coming. And for us in community supervision, it can sometimes feel like we're serving a lot of different masters. But taking the time to address victims' issues and concerns can go a long way to making our communities overall safer and improving our client outcomes, and that's ultimately our goal. So it might feel like a step backwards or it might feel like something completely different than what we've always done, but ultimately we're meeting the exact same goals that we've always been working towards. So a couple of questions. There was one question earlier in the program. So Jim, this might be one for you. So what was the name of the screening tool for victims that you all mentioned, and where can they find it?
Well, there was 2 of them, I think, that we mentioned. We probably talked about Jacqueline Campbell's lethality assessment. So if you write danger assessment, might even be able to go to dangerassessment.org. You'll find information on that. Or if anybody writes Jacqueline Campbell, you can find all sorts of stuff on her lethality assessment. The other one was coercivecontrol.org. And there's a tool called the SHARP tool. So you can Google it a couple different ways. You can just Google SHARP tool, and it would probably say T.K. Logan, University of Kentucky. But if you go to coercivecontrol.org, there's actually some different tools. There's some different articles on stalking, and then the SHARP tool's on there. You can go through it. I would recommend probation just play with it. She said don't use your real partner's name because her husband doesn't like reading about him being a stalker laying around the house. So like I did mine, and I just made it somebody else. Like make up a fake fictitious name and go through and just answer it. And you'll be surprised at what a good report. It talks about you in the third person, but it say, Jim is being stalked by this person. This is happening. This is happening. This is happening. These are the concerns. And it can actually, I could recommend that to a woman who I think's being stalked and say, listen, I'm concerned. I'm worried. This is a free tool for you. If you, do this and print it out, you could share it with an advocate. You could share it with me. You could share it with the police if you wanted to go forward. But it would help you kind of organize your thoughts, know what to think, and to be able to identify. Because a lot of behavior we look as just annoying or irritating can actually be stalking. And I think they do a really good job with that tool.
I think you also mentioned the ODARA briefly, Jim. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So the ODARA or LAP, were actually created specifically for police to use at the scene. And they're more of a risk, not lethality assessment. They're saying, what's the probability of this guy reassaulting this particular victim or another victim? And it gives you kind of a scoring rate that can help determine bail. Some probation departments around the country are using it now to determine a level of supervision. I know they do in Maine. So if I was going to do the ODERA, I'd talk to Faye Lupi in Maine, and I could get them information for her. The DVISR, tons of information on that online. But if somebody also emails me, I can send you a lot of the research and the questions. They're actually, the questions for the DVISR are not that different from the ODERA. They're just created for probation to ask. I noticed you went to the next page. My email at jhenderson@bwjp.org may not work after this week. I may be transitioning over to the Strangulation Institute. So people can email me at james_henderson@yahoo.com. Or they can always get a hold of you and Connie. You're going to know how to get a hold of me if there's any problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone had access to our contact information. We didn't have any additional questions at this time, but thank you all for meeting with us today and staying a little bit after noon. All of us are available for any follow-up questions. We know that we threw a lot of information at you guys and didn't go particularly in depth on things. So please follow up with us if you have any questions or concerns. And maybe we'll see some of you guys next week. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Connie. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.